First of all, the Waco Davidians for a long time were a totally peaceful, benign group. Then came Vernon Howell, later named David Koresh, and he became very close to Lois Roden at the end of her life, and then he took over. And that's when the trouble started, because he tried to kill her son, George Roden, and the prosecutor said, that guy is going to be trouble.
Let's talk about, what are the conversations like when a woman gives up her children in a cult?
Well,
that has to be some serious programming to overtake Mother Nature's instinct of, these are my kids.
The most terrible situation I ever dealt with where a parent gave up a child was Carrie Jewell. I met her. When she was 10 years old, her mother gave her to David Koresh, the leader of the Waco Davidians, and he raped her. And she would eventually testify in a congressional hearing when she was 14 about what happened. And I remember doing the Phil Donahue show with Carrie during the standoff, and we were all talking about whether or not David Koresh would ever surrender and come out from the compound, which he never did. And at the time, he asked each person on the panel, how do you think this is going to end? And when he got to Carrie Jewell, she said, they're all going to die. And I've made my peace. My mother will never come out. And I was shocked, but she was right. She was absolutely right. And I think that her father, David Jewell, who was a very brave man and who rescued his daughter from the compound before the raid and before the standoff occurred, and she was safely with him in his custody when all that happened, that she knew, and David Jewell knew, just how totally brainwashed the people were in that compound. Because this woman, I'm sure, was a loving mother, but she was so programmed by David Koresh to believe that he was the seed, the Davidic seed, the Messiah, that she thought that giving her child to the Messiah was a godly thing to do. And they were told that he was planting the seed of David in these victims that he raped. And I think one of the reasons why he did not surrender was he knew that when they did DNA testing, they would establish that he was a pedophile and that he had sex with minor children and that they had children when they were children.
Oh, man. Can we go into the Waco incident a little bit? What was that cult about?
First of all, the Waco Davidians for a long time were a totally peaceful, benign group, kind of unusual. They followed the teachings of a man named Victor Houteff. And after Houteff died, his widow took over. And after her, a man named George Roden took over. And after that, his wife, Lois Roden, took over. And for years and years, they were peaceful. And they lived outside of Waco on a kind of ranch area on the outskirts of Waco. Then came Vernon Howell, later named David Koresh, and he became very close to Lois Roden at the end of her life, and then he took over. And that's when the trouble started, because he tried to kill her son, George Roden, and he was tried for attempted murder, but a hung jury was the end result. And the prosecutor said, that guy is going to be trouble. And he went back to the compound. He was stockpiling weapons. And unbeknownst to me, he was also raping children and abusing women in the group. That would later come out. So the BATF then did an investigation. And I had deprogrammed one of the Waco Davidians. David Koresh had sent him on a kind of trip to get some money and do some fundraising in California. And his brother retained me, and I did an intervention, and he never came back. And he still lives in California, and he has a family. But he was a witness to illegal weapons and stockpiling that was going on inside the Davidian compound. David Koresh was manufacturing guns. He was converting semi-automatic weapons to fully automatic. He was breaking the law regarding firearms. And so the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms investigated him. They called me. They interviewed the young man that I deprogrammed. It was their interview with that young man that I deprogrammed, and in part his testimony that led to an affidavit that was then the basis for a warrant for the search of the Davidian compound and a warrant for the arrest of David Koresh. So the BATF went there. I was shocked at the way they went. I mean, we had warned them about how many weapons and how huge the stockpile was and how militant the group was and how totally, really psychopath like David Koresh was. And the BATF just raided the group in a way that shocked me. I mean, they just went in like it was any normal raid, which it wasn't. And of course, it was a gun battle. People were killed. Davidians died. Federal agents were killed in the process. And then they created a perimeter around the compound, and there was a 51-day standoff.
51 days?
51 days. And during that time, I worked for CBS News, and I was interviewed by the FBI and by their hostage negotiator that they had. But the problem that the FBI had at that time, which I don't think they have now, because they learned from Waco and subsequent situations, that this was not a conventional hostage situation, that the Davidians were not hostages, they were programmed. They were completely and totally subservient to David Koresh, and that dynamic needed to be understood. And so much of what I suggested to the FBI, they did not do. Some of the things I suggested that they do, they did. For example, David Koresh, who said, "I am Jesus, I am the Messiah." They said, well, Jesus loved children. And he said, "Suffer not the little children to come unto me. So would you let some of the children out?" And David Koresh did let out 21 children. And he let out some of the elderly people, people that he thought were essentially a burden or expendable. He kept most of the Davidians in. Now, then the FBI set up these big loudspeakers around the compound, and they would keep the Davidians up at night. They would blast them with rock and roll music, rabbits screaming, things that probably fit within the typical hostage negotiator playbook. But they did not understand. They were dealing with a cult. They were dealing with cult members. And what I suggested was that they give them every opportunity to get sleep, to be rested, so they could think more clearly. And then maybe during the 9 to 5 hours, bring in family and let the family talk to their loved ones through those loudspeakers, because David Koresh was controlling all communication in that compound. When families wanted to visit someone, you had to go to visitation. Wow. In the compound, and there would be Koresh or a delegated person that would be monitoring your visit with your family member. There were only 2 phones in the compound. One was an old, gigantic mobile phone. Hard to believe how big those were. And the other was a hard line. He controlled both. He listened to all conversations. So what I suggested to the FBI, and they did not do this, was use the loudspeakers so the families can speak to their loved ones. Kind of like, almost like Radio Free Davidian. where there could be communication that he did not control. They did not do that. And then I also told them, please don't act aggressively on the perimeter, because that basically validates his narrative that you're Satan, that you are the army of Satan come to attack the people of God. What you want to do is make yourselves as peaceful and non-threatening as possible to undercut his narrative, which they did not do. In fairness to the FBI, they had never dealt with a cult like this before, and it was their first experience, and they learned from it painfully. But in the final analysis, I don't think it was going to end any way other than it ended, which is how David Koresh wanted it to end. And he did not want to live. He was like Jim Jones. He wanted to go out with his followers on his throne, king to the bitter end. That's how David Koresh left the world, ruling over his flock in the compound.
No matter where you're watching Shawn Ryan Show from, if you get anything out of this, please like, comment, subscribe, and most importantly, share this everywhere you possibly can. And if you're feeling extra generous, please leave us a review on Apple and Spotify podcasts.